for this third and, for now at least, final part of my Austerity conversion. There aren't many parts left on the etch now. We've just got the brakes, the coupling rods and the brake pull rods to worry about. As you can hopefully see, the coupling rods and the brake blocks are etched inside subframes of the main etched fret. And this is a really clever design idea whereby these subframes have half-etched fold lines that enable you to get the two layers of these components in perfect registration for soldering together. I'm going to start with the brakes as they're the next components required to be attached to the chassis, and the first job is to tin the backs of them. I'm just dotting the solder around with the iron, and then I'll spread it out so that I get a nice even thin coating on all the separate parts. I'm trying to avoid as far as possible clogging up all the tiny holes where the brake hanger rods need to poke through. With a 180-degree fold, it's general practice to put the half-etch line on the outside of the bend, and a little nip up with the pliers will ensure that these are folded fully back. I can then introduce the soldering iron to the tinned parts and they will be sweated together. Because I control the amount of solder used for the tinning, this shouldn't make a mess or require too much cleaning up. What I do need to do, however, is run a tiny broach through each of these holes to open them out to accept the brake hanger rods. By checking against the loco chassis, I can ascertain how far I need to go in with the broach and make all these holes the same size while they're still attached to the frame. Rather generously, you're given one spare brake block for each side of the chassis, and I'm going to leave that one attached to the frame so I know where to find it, just in case. Now, when it comes to fixing the brakes onto the hangers, things do get a little bit precarious because there is no surefire way of aligning them correctly. You have to line them up against the wheel treads in 2 dimensions by eye and then contrive a way of holding them so they don't move while you do the actual soldering. My aim when looking down on the chassis from above is to get the front face of the brake block perfectly in line with the front face of the wheel when the wheel's pushed in as far as it will go, and then it's a case of putting pressure on the bottom of the brake hanger with my fingertip to stop it moving around. This one looks okay, but it needs to be carefully tested and inspected to make sure there's no chance of it touching the wheel flange or tread as the axle moves from side to side. I don't want to risk it becoming a functional brake for the locomotive. At least not until the day DCC controlled working brakes become a thing. I'm concentrating so carefully on getting the brake the right distance from the frame here that I've not noticed that my fingers pulled the bottom end backwards and the brake block doesn't line up with the wheel tread anymore. That's not really a problem as I can just bend it forward with my finger and it'll hold its new position. The only critical thing is making sure the brake box don't stick out beyond the wheels so that they can't catch on the coupling rods as they go round. Here's another one that needs a little tweak. These tiny holes in the brake pull rods need opening out with a broach to 0.3mm so that they'll fit on the cross shaft, and it's much easier to do this job while the parts are still attached to the main fret. A good etch designer will make holes like this undersized so that they can be opened out to fit, and if there's any slight over etching at the manufacturing stage, it won't cause a disaster. Here I'm just trying to measure the size of the hole in the frames for the main brake cross shaft so I can open out the ones in the pull rods to the right size. But in the words of Police Chief Brodie, we're gonna need a bigger broach. I think he had a problem with the jaws of his vice or something. Fortunately, there's still a little bit of metal around the hole by the time I've finished. There's a little bit of cusp left over from the etching process along the edge of these rods, and I want to remove that, along with all traces of the joining tabs before I fit them to the loco chassis. The pull rods need to be positioned between the frames like this, one on either side, but it's immediately obvious that the gear on the rear axle is going to interfere with one of them, and the easiest solution is just to remove a part of it. It's just a pity I didn't think of that before I spent time opening out the hole to fit this cross shaft at the back. Nevertheless, I can now start the assembly, and as you'll see, it's a little bit like French knitting. Once I've got that rear cross shaft fitted, I'm going to solder it to the frames to keep it in place, but I'm going to leave the pull rod loose for the time being. You'll notice that I've cut the wire quite a bit over length as well, and that's just to make it easier to handle. Next comes the much thinner wire at the front end of the chassis, and that has to be threaded through the brake hangers without bending them out of place, and also both pull rods. As before, I'm going to secure this cross shaft at the outer edges and leave the pull rods loose for now. And now the fun really begins with the intermediate cross shafts. Once all the cross shafts are secured, I can line up the pull rods, make sure they're straight and parallel, and then fix them in place. And having completed that task, I immediately decided that they were too close to the centre line of the chassis. Still, it's an easy enough job at this stage to nudge them out closer to the wheels. Just remelt the solder and a little bit of finger pressure will slide those pull rods along the cross shaft. Because of the springiness of the metal, the pull rods kept trying to straighten themselves out, so in the end I found it easiest to nudge them out a little bit at a time, working my way backwards and forwards from one cross shaft to the next. All of these cross shafts will eventually need to have gaps cut in them to prevent them electrically joining the two halves of the chassis, but I like to leave that until as late as possible. One thing I can't leave till any later is trimming off the ends of the shafts though, because they're going to get in the way of the next details I need to fit. Once I've finished filing the ends of the main brake cross shaft square, I can bend out guard irons. There are no marks or guidelines for doing this bending, but my rule of thumb is to bend them out to about 45 degrees where they join the frames, and then a reverse 45-degree bend about halfway along. I'm aiming to get the vertical part roughly in line with the centre of the wheel treads, so it will be sitting over the rail when the loco's on the tracks. Once they're done, it's back to the side cutters to carry on the job of trimming back the excess wire from the other cross shafts. You have to be very careful not to get carried away doing this and chop off the crank pins or the footplate support brackets by mistake. It's not happened to me yet, but I'm conscious that I'm only ever one snip away from disaster. I'm moving on to the sand delivery pipes now, and these are made from more lengths of 0.3mm nickel silver wire with a bend in the middle. By making the wires over length, I can hold the bottom edge against the wheel tread, and that will give me the correct height when I poke it up into the hole in the bottom of the sandbox and solder it in place. And once the top end's firmly fixed in place, any necessary tweaking can be done to make sure that the wire's vertical when looking at it from both the side and behind, and that the pipe at the bottom is parallel to the frames as well. Once I'm happy that everything's as it should be, I'm going to solder this pipe to the bottom of the brake hanger. It's not prototypical to fix it there, but it does stop it getting bent out of shape. And finally, I can trim back the end of the wire so it's not quite touching the wheel. I also want to make sure that that wire doesn't touch the rail. I don't want it catching on point crossings or anything. So a quick track test and a careful observation to make sure that the clearances are okay is what's required next. And so far everything's looking good, so I just need to repeat the process for the other 3 sandboxes. For the pipes at the rear of the loco, there are no brake hangers to secure them to, but fortunately those guard irons are in just the right place. A carefully controlled amount of solder on the end of the iron will make sure this solder joint is secure but not obtrusive. Before fixing the bottom end of the second rear sand pipe, I just want to do a quick eyeball check through the frames to make sure that the angles of the pipes are matching on both sides. And this is where my OCD comes into play just a little bit, where I'm using the square end of my steel ruler to check that the lengths of these sandpipes is identical on both sides of the chassis. And they're not quite. One last little job in this area before moving on is to smooth off the cut ends of the brake cross shafts. Finally, the time has come to cut the gaps in those cross shafts and electrically separate the 2 halves of the chassis again. I'm aiming to remove at least 1 millimetre of material from the shaft, so there's no chance of the 2 ends springing together and touching each other. And at some point in the future, I'll be able to take a short length of insulating sleeve from a piece of fine wire and slide it over the ends and remove that gap visually. Cutting that thicker wire at the back end has distorted it slightly, so I just need to bend everything back into its proper alignment. I'm turning my attention to the coupling rods now, and they're formed of 2 layers of etched material. Well, one is actually half etched for the most part, and they need to be folded over and sweated together in much the same way as the brake blocks and hangers were. When tinning the backs of these rods, I obviously need enough solder to cover the metal surface, but I don't want to use too much and block up those crankpin holes. I also need to avoid heating these long, thin parts so much that they distort, especially the half-etched rod. One of my maxims is that you can never really have too much flux, and that the solder is only going to flow where the flux is, so I want a good amount between these 2 layers of the coupling rods. also putting flux on the outside of the rods so that I get good heat transfer from the tip of my soldering iron. Some of the tinning, that's the thin layer of solder coating the tip of the iron, is going to transfer onto these rods, and it's that telltale silver trail along with signs of the flux boiling off that let me know enough heat's gone into the joint and it's been made properly. And in this instance, more than enough heat has also got into my fingertip, and you'll notice I've changed to using a pair of tweezers to hold the parts down as I move along the rods. I need to be very careful not to distort the rods while cutting them out, because they are very thin and fragile. Now, because these are made of 2 layers of etch, there will be some cusp along the top, and it's worthwhile taking a fine file to remove that and try and make these look like it's one piece of metal rather than 2 layers together. Using a very fine number 6 cut file and going slowly and gently is key to success here. I'm also having to be very careful just taking them in and out of the vise that I don't catch them and bend them. That would be a disaster. By way of comparison, if I angle this top edge that I've dressed into the light, you can see from the reflection that it's perfectly smooth, whereas on the underneath, hopefully you'll be able to notice the striations there. That cusp also needs to be removed from the bosses on the ends of the rods, along with the remains of the joining tags. The final task in preparing the coupling rods is to run a broach through the holes so they're a nice easy fit on the crank pins. Too tight and the chassis will bind, too loose and the rods will look like they're doing a seesaw motion as the chassis moves along. And in case anyone's wondering, I've never found it necessary to make jointed rods in 2mm scale. The rods need to be tested for free running on the crank pins before being finally fixed in place, so I'm using some insulating sleeve from some fine wire just pushed over the long crank pins to temporarily retain them. Once I'm happy with the running, the plan is to solder some retaining washers onto the crank pins, and these ones you can see here are part of an etch sold by the 2mm Scale Association for that very purpose. I happen to have some more etched washers from another source which are a tiny bit thinner, and I think on reflection, given the skinniness of the rods on this loco, might be more appropriate, so I'm going to use those instead. The only difficulty with using these washers is making sure they don't disappear into the ether when you cut them from the fret. To provide the necessary running clearance, I'm going to use a piece of paper as a spacer behind the washer. I'm using ordinary 80 gram per square metre photocopier paper, and I've drilled a little hole in it so it'll slip over the crank pin. As well as providing clearance, this paper is also going to form a barrier to prevent solder getting behind the washer and fixing the coupling rod to the crank pin. I'm letting a drop of oil soak into the paper to help with this before adding flux to where the joint's going to be made. I'm trying to hold the washer down against the paper by its very edges with the tweezers, and once the joint's been made, I'm trying to draw the solder up the crank pin so it doesn't form a big blob around the washer. The theory goes that I should be able to tear this paper away from the crank pin easily, but it's putting up rather a good fight. Whatever remains will probably disintegrate over time, but I could always pick at it with the point of a scalpel blade, being careful of course not to dislodge the washer. You may remember back in part 2 I had to shorten this rear crank pin, and that makes fitting the washer a little bit more precarious. The main danger comes when introducing the flux, because there's a risk that the washer will stick to the flux on the cocktail stick and be carried away with it. Once all 3 washers are soldered in place, the crank pins can be trimmed back and the ends filed off flush. The needle file I'm using for this little job is a cheap and nasty one whose teeth are already gunked up with solder. And then it's on to the other side of the chassis to do the same again. opting to do battle with the paper spacers with pliers rather than tweezers this time around, but they're still putting up strong resistance. At least it's a good test as to whether the washers are soldered on securely. And with everything ready, it's time to repeat the roll test, which is passed with flying colours. It's all very well being able to roll down a slope, but I really want to find out how this chassis will perform under power. I've given everything a good clean, but once the motor's attached I won't be able to get the chassis properly wet, so from now on I need to use a rosin flux rather than an acidic flux that won't require washing off. The ends of the rear frame spacer form two very convenient solder pads where I can attach the motor leads and they'll be hidden under the cab floor. I'm considering this a temporary arrangement because at some point in the future I'm going to want to come back and fit DCC to this loco, and I will be hardwiring the decoder to the chassis. Don't worry, I will make a video of what I do, but for now I just want to get the basic conversion up and running. In fact, there's quite a bit more I could do to this loco in terms of cosmetic enhancements as well, so maybe there'll be at least 2 more videos at some point in the future. My immediate concern though is how to get more weight into this loco. As it came out of the box it was really too light, and the replacement chassis I've built is a gram or two lighter than the original. Fortunately there's plenty of room around these gears to thread the motor wires without them catching on anything. The motor's quite a tight push fit into its cradle and I'm hoping it'll hold itself in place. I'm just going to try fitting the saddle tank and cab over the boiler and firebox to get an impression of how everything's going to look when it's all together, even though I'm probably going to have to take it apart again quite soon. A surprising amount of force is needed to get the cab to snap down over the back of the firebox. Apart from that big gap under the bunker that's going to need filling in with something, this is not looking too bad at all. I found that I needed to screw the motor cover in place to keep the worm in mesh, and a little extra weight was required for adhesion, but it works, and once I've oiled it and run it in and found some places to hide a bit of extra weight around the body, I think it's just going to get better and better. When compared side by side with the original chassis block, the visual improvement speaks for itself, but the gear ratio is also significantly improved, which should give a performance advantage over just replacing the wheels with 2 FS ones. So here she is with the body reattached on the rolling road. And I haven't done any oiling or running in at this point, I just wanted to give you an impression of how she runs straight off the workbench. And I have to say, at this point I'm really pleased with how things have gone. There's a bit more work to do to get the model to the stage where I'd be happy to run it on a layout, but the chassis is basically complete now. These little austerities do hold a special place in my heart. When I'm not at my modelling bench, I'm often to be found at the MC and Bolton Abbey Steam Railway, where I volunteer on the footplate, and I've operated several of these locomotives down the years. I did my very first shift as an engine cleaner on one of these locos, and years later found myself on the very same one for my driving test. So I'd like to leave you with some austerity inspiration in the form of a montage of photos and videos I took from the footplate at MC one wintry day during our Santa season a few years ago, when 2 austerities were working the line in fine style.